Arc Raiders doesn't hand you its story on a plate, and this video is going to walk you through the entire known timeline, piecing together what the lore suggests about where this world came from, what the Ark actually wants, and where this fractured, war-torn Earth might be heading. I want to take a second before we get into any of the actual lore to explain why I made this video and how I assembled it. Arc Raiders has this layered, fragmented storytelling style where the big picture is almost never given to you outright. The story lives in environmental details, item descriptions, scattered audio logs, faction dialogue, and the kind of background texture that most players never slow down long enough to absorb. When I started pulling all of that together into a coherent timeline, I made a deliberate choice to front-load the human story. The pre-invasion period gets more space here than it might in other lore breakdowns, because I think grounding the audience in what life looks like before the Ark arrived makes everything that follows land with more weight. I also chose to treat the Ark's origin as an open question throughout, rather than committing to one reading early, because the lore genuinely seems to support multiple interpretations, and I didn't want to close off threads that are still being seeded in new content. This is my read of the available material. Where things get speculative, I'll say so. Where the evidence points clearly in one direction, I'll say that too. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. Before the Sky Changed. The world of Arc Raiders is not a world that collapsed overnight. That is one of the first things the lore points toward when you start piecing together the fragments left behind in the underground settlements and the ruined surface zones. The collapse was slow at first. It was the kind of slow that people explained away, season after season, because it never crossed the threshold that would force anyone to act. The sky was still blue most mornings, the cities still functioned, the supply chain still moved, but underneath all of that, something was already shifting, and the records suggest that at least some people knew it. Before the Ark came, Earth was recognizably modern. The lore doesn't place this story in some distant speculative future. The technology, the social structures, the way people organize their lives and their governments all point toward a world that was an extension of our own, maybe a few decades forward, maybe less. Cities were dense and connected. Communication networks were sophisticated. There were space programs, orbital platforms, long-range observation systems pointed outward into the solar system. The infrastructure was advanced enough that when something anomalous first appeared at the edge of detectable range, it was detected. That detail matters. The Ark was seen coming. The question the lore keeps circling back to is what happened between that detection and the arrival. The early warning systems, as best as the scattered documentation suggests, registered something unusual in the outer solar system well before any kind of planetary response was organized. The nature of that signal is described differently across the various sources. Some fragments reference a debris field that didn't move the way debris should. Others point toward a series of radio anomalies that ground stations initially attributed to equipment error. What the lore seems to agree on is that the first observations were not alarming enough to escalate quickly. They were anomalies in a world full of anomalies. Scientists flagged them, filed reports, and waited for more data. More data came, but by then the timeline for a meaningful response had already begun to compress. There is a particular set of documents referenced in the game's environment that points toward a scientific community that was divided in its interpretation of the incoming data. One reading suggests that a portion of the research community identified the signatures as artificial almost immediately, and pushed for that interpretation to be taken seriously at a governmental level. Another portion of that same community pushed back, arguing that the signatures were consistent with natural phenomena and that the artificial reading was a case of pattern matching gone wrong. This internal disagreement is significant not because it delayed anything by decades, but because it created exactly the kind of institutional hesitation that allowed months to pass before anyone started treating the situation as a threat rather than a curiosity. What is particularly striking about the pre-Ark world, at least as the law frames it, is how normal everyday life remained even as the evidence accumulated. This is not presented as a failure of intelligence or imagination on the part of the people living through it. It is presented more as a structural reality. The systems that governed how information became policy, how scientific consensus became public knowledge, and how public knowledge became political action were all optimized for a world in which problems emerged gradually and responded to negotiation. The incoming Ark did not respond to any of those things, but that incompatibility was not obvious until it was too late to matter. The economic conditions of the pre-Ark world are sketched in the law with enough detail to suggest that the divide between those who had access to safety infrastructure and those who did not was already significant before the Ark arrived. The underground shelter networks that various factions eventually occupied were not built in the weeks or months before the invasion. They were pre-existing structures, some of them constructed as continuity of government facilities, others as commercial developments targeting wealthy clients who wanted protection from a vague, generalized sense of instability. The law points toward this quietly but consistently. The bunkers already existed. The question of who had access to them was already answered before anyone knew they would be needed. The space programs of the pre-Ark world are referenced in enough contexts across the law to suggest they were robust and ambitious. There were orbital platforms in use for various purposes: research, communication relay, resource observation, and at least some military presence at high altitude. These installations became significant in a different way once the Ark arrived, but before that, they represented the outer edge of human reach into the solar system. The people staffing those platforms would have been among the first to get a clear visual on what was coming. The law suggests, without spelling it out, that the communications from those stations in the final pre-arrival period were not widely shared with the general public. There were political structures in the pre-Ark world that were trying, in various ways, to coordinate a global response to the approaching situation. The law doesn't give these structures names that map cleanly onto our present-day institutions, which is either a deliberate choice to avoid dating the setting or a reflection of the fact that by the time the Ark arrived, those structures had already partially dissolved under the strain of internal disagreements. What the fragments suggest is that whatever coordination did exist was fragmented, contested, and ultimately not decisive. Some regions organised evacuations. Others prioritised military responses that the law implies were ineffective from the beginning. Others appear to have done very little at all, betting that the situation would resolve itself or that someone else would handle it. The cultural response to the approaching crisis is one of the more interesting threads in the pre-Ark law, and it is easy to miss because it mostly lives in environmental detail rather than direct documentation. The graffiti in certain above-ground zones, the art and symbols found in some of the older shelter sections, and the names and emblems that certain factions use all carry traces of the belief systems and cultural responses that emerged as the truth about the Ark became harder to deny. Some communities turned inward, building intensely local bonds in anticipation of a world where global connection would no longer be reliable. Others became intensely ideological, organising around particular interpretations of what was coming and what it meant. The law doesn't seem to judge any of these responses. It just preserves the traces of them. The families and communities that are referenced in the personal logs and environmental storytelling scattered across Ark Raiders zones are painted with a kind of matter-of-fact sadness. People were going about their lives. They were working, raising children, making long-term plans. The law includes references to building projects that were abandoned midway, to travel arrangements that were never completed, to communications between people who never got a response. These fragments are not laboured over, they are just there, embedded in the texture of a world that stopped in the middle of everything. That quality of incompleteness is one of the most effective things the law does, and it sets the emotional register for everything that follows. The scientific and military communities of the pre-arc world, based on what the law suggests, did manage to produce some useful analysis of the incoming threat before it arrived. There are references to documents describing the arc's propulsion signatures, the composition of their outer shells, and certain behavioural patterns observed during the approach phase. Whether any of that analysis informed anything useful in terms of defence is less clear. The law points toward a situation where the information existed, but the institutional capacity to act on it in a coordinated way had already broken down. This pattern, knowing but not being able to respond effectively, is one that the Ark Raiders law returns to repeatedly, in the pre-invasion period and afterward. The communications infrastructure of the pre-Ark world, by most readings of the available law, remained partially functional through the early stages of the Ark's arrival. This is significant because it means that a large portion of the global population was watching what happened in real time, or something close to real time, rather than experiencing it in isolation. The shared experience of the first Ark contacts was mediated through the same screens and networks people used for everything else in their lives. The law suggests this created a strange quality to those early hours and days, where the scale of what was happening was visible, but the reality of it had not yet registered at a gut level for most people. What the pre-Ark world looks like from the perspective of someone living underground today is something the law explores through the way survivors and second-generation underground inhabitants talk about it. There is a consistent quality to these references, a sense of that world being impossibly stable and impossibly comfortable by current standards, even though, by the standards of its own time, it was not without serious problems. The distance of catastrophe has a way of smoothing over the difficulties of what came before it, and the law is aware of that effect without being cynical about it. The people referencing the old world are not naive. They just lost something real. The agricultural and food production systems of the pre-Ark world are touched on in the law in ways that connect to the survival economy of the present. Some of the underground settlements maintain references to the food technologies that existed before the collapse, not just as historical curiosities, but as aspirational models. The law suggests that the pre-Ark world had developed significant capacity for controlled environment agriculture, and that some of that knowledge and some of that infrastructure survived the initial catastrophe and was adapted for underground use. This thread of technological continuity is one of the ways the law suggests that the collapse was not total, that things were lost but not everything was lost. The military and defence preparations made in the pre-Ark period are described across several sources in ways that point toward a massive mobilisation that was, in the end, tactically courageous and strategically useless. Weapons systems that had been designed to counter other human threats were repurposed and deployed against the incoming Ark. The law doesn't dismiss these efforts. It acknowledges the scale of the response and the genuine determination behind it, but it also makes clear, through the shape of the world that resulted, that the defense infrastructure of the pre-Ark world was not built to stop what was coming. This isn't framed as a failure of the people involved. It is framed as a fundamental mismatch. The children who grew up in the late pre-Ark period occupy an interesting position in the law's social texture. The current adult population of the underground, by the implied timeline, would include people who were very young when the Ark arrived, old enough to have some memories of the surface world, but not old enough to have understood what was happening as it unfolded. The law hints at the particular psychological weight this carries, a generation defined by having been present for something enormous without having been able to comprehend it at the time. The ways those early impressions shaped the cultures and belief systems of the underground are woven throughout the faction lore in ways that are easy to miss but add real depth. There are several specific locations referenced in the lore that existed in the pre-Ark world and have particular significance. These are not always major population centers. Some of them are research facilities, remote outposts, infrastructure nodes. Their significance in the post-Ark world comes from what they contained or what happened there during the transition. The lore doesn't always connect these locations to their pre-Ark histories in obvious ways. Sometimes you have to work backward from what a place is now to understand what it was before. And that process of working backward is one of the most rewarding parts of engaging with Ark Raiders world building. The pre-Ark world had its own internal conflicts, its own political fractures and resource competitions, and the lore does not erase those. They show up in the fault lines between different surviving factions and in the grudges and alliances that carried over from before the collapse into the underground period. Some of the tensions between groups in the current timeline are not about the Ark at all. They are about things that predate the Ark, old disputes and old loyalties that the collapse intensified rather than resolved. This adds a layer of complexity to the faction dynamics that makes them feel more real, because real groups of people do not stop having complicated histories just because an external catastrophe occurs. The environmental conditions of the pre-Ark world, as suggested by various lore sources, included a range of already developing crises that the Ark's arrival both interrupted and, in some strange ways, superseded. The lore does not dwell on this, but it does register it. The world that the Ark arrived in was not a stable paradise. It was a world already dealing with systemic strains. The Ark's arrival collapsed all of those ongoing processes into a single, overwhelming emergency, which meant that some long-term problems were simply abandoned mid-development, while others became much more acute very quickly. The post-Ark ecology of the surface reflects both the pre-existing conditions and the dramatic changes wrought by the Ark themselves. The communication logs and personal messages preserved in the lore from the pre-Ark period have a quality that is hard to define, but easy to feel. They were written by people who did not know they were writing for posterity. They were written in the register of daily life, with the shorthand and assumed context of people communicating with others who share their world. Reading them now, in the light of what followed, gives them a weight they were never intended to carry. The lore uses this effect carefully, not as cheap emotional manipulation, but as a genuine technique for anchoring the abstract horror of civilizational collapse in specific human detail. The industrial infrastructure of the pre-Ark world is referenced in the lore primarily through its remnants. The manufacturing complexes, the power generation facilities, the transportation networks that raiders now pick through for salvage were all operational in living memory. The lore suggests that these systems were not only functional, but in many cases still expanding, still being upgraded and developed right up until the collapse. There is something particularly striking about the scale of ongoing investment in long-term infrastructure projects that implies no expectation of interruption, overlapping with the period when the Ark's approach was already being tracked. It points toward the genuine difficulty of acting on abstract threat information, even when that information is available. The social fabric of the pre-Ark world, as it comes through in the lore, was diverse and in many ways resilient. Different communities had developed different ways of organizing themselves, different values, different relationships to technology and tradition. The collapse did not homogenize all of that. Traces of those distinct identities persisted into the underground period and continue to shape the cultures and conflicts of the present. The factions that exist today are not just products of post-Ark survival pressures. They are also products of the varied human cultures that entered the underground and tried to maintain their identities in a radically altered environment. The legal and governance systems of the pre-Ark world are referenced obliquely in the lore, through the way people in the underground talk about rights, property, authority, and legitimacy. These concepts did not disappear with the surface world. They were carried underground and adapted, sometimes beyond recognition, but the underlying frameworks still shape how people think about social order. Some of the most significant conflicts in the current timeline are essentially arguments about which pre-arc frameworks are still legitimate and which ones died with the surface world. These are not idle philosophical debates. They are disputes about who has the right to make decisions that affect everyone's survival. The medical and scientific knowledge of the pre-arc world represents one of the clearest threads of continuity in the law. The underground communities depend heavily on pre-arc medical knowledge, and the scarcity of medical supplies is a recurring theme in Arc Raiders world building. The people who carried that knowledge underground, the doctors, researchers, and technicians who became extraordinarily valuable the moment the world changed, are referenced in the law in ways that trace how expertise became a form of power in the post-arc social structure. The relationship between knowledge and survival, between what you know and whether you live, is one of the running themes of the pre-arc to post-arc transition. The art and culture of the pre-arc world preserved in the underground takes various forms across the law. There are references to music, to literature, to visual art that was carried into the shelters, either physically or in digital archives. The decisions people made about what to save when they had limited capacity to save things point toward questions about what a culture considers essential versus what it considers expendable. The law handles this with a light touch, but the presence of cultural artifacts in the underground is not incidental. It represents a deliberate act of continuity, a refusal to let the collapse define the totality of what people were and what they valued. The transportation networks of the pre-arc world left physical traces that matter enormously in the current timeline. The roads, tunnels, rail lines, and port facilities that raiders navigate on the surface are largely pre-arc construction. The fact that human infrastructure was built to last, built to be maintained and upgraded rather than abandoned, means that even after the arc's disruptions, these networks remain partially navigable. The law uses this physical continuity to create a poignant contrast between the scale of pre-arc ambition and the much more modest scale of current survival. Raiders moving through the ruins of transit hubs and logistics centres are moving through the skeleton of a world that had very different ideas about where it was going. The relationship between the pre-arc world and the space around Earth is one of the law threads that connects most directly to the central mystery of the arc themselves. The orbital infrastructure that existed before the collapse was not just a communications and observation system. It was, by some readings of the law, the first point of contact between human technology and arc technology. The exact nature of that contact is left ambiguous, but the suggestion that the outer edges of human reach may have intersected with arc activity before anyone on the ground knew anything was happening adds a layer of complexity to the timeline that is worth holding on to as we move through the rest of this story. The final days before the arc's arrival at Earth, as the law constructs them, were marked by a rapid escalation in the quality and quantity of information available, alongside a rapid breakdown in the institutions that would normally have processed and responded to that information. This collision between a data environment becoming richer and more alarming by the hour and a decision-making environment that was already fragmenting under the strain meant that the last period before the invasion was characterized by both heightened awareness and profound paralysis. Different regions and communities responded differently. Some mobilized effectively within their local capacity. Others found that the information itself was contested at the very moment when clear-eyed action was most needed. There is a category of pre-arc law that relates to the belief systems and spiritual communities that developed in response to the approaching situation. These range from communities that interpreted the incoming arc in religious terms, as judgment, as transcendence, as testing, to communities that developed secular but intense ideological frameworks for understanding what was happening. The law does not endorse or dismiss any of these frameworks. It registers their existence as a fact of how people respond to situations that exceed normal categories of understanding. Some of these frameworks persisted into the underground period and became foundational to the belief systems of current factions. The families separated during the chaos of the pre-arrival period are one of the personal scale tragedies that the law returns to repeatedly. The communication logs include messages from people trying to locate others, trying to confirm survival, trying to coordinate movement across a fragmenting world. Many of these messages were never received, or received too late to be acted on. The networks that carried them were already failing. The law uses these fragments not to dwell in sentimentality, but to make concrete the scale of what was lost in purely human terms, before even getting to the physical destruction that followed. The pre-arch educational systems and the knowledge they transmitted are referenced in the law through the way people in the underground talk about what they were taught versus what they needed to know. The gap between formal education and practical survival knowledge is a recurring theme, and it connects to a broader question about how societies transmit the information that matters most. The raiders themselves, by most readings of the character law, are people who learned what they know through experience rather than institution, and that quality of earned practical knowledge is valued very differently in the current world than credentials from a world that no longer exists. The infrastructure projects that were under construction at the time of the Ark's arrival are some of the most evocative environmental details in the surface zones. Half-completed buildings, excavations that were never filled, tunneling projects that stopped midway through their planned course. These are not just scenery. They are evidence of a specific moment, the moment when long-term planning stopped mattering and immediate survival became the only project worth working on. The law places these abandoned works in the landscape without comment, trusting the player or listener to register what they mean. The communication between different regions of the world in the pre-Ark period was sophisticated enough that the collapse of those networks was itself a major event with cascading consequences. The moment when global real-time communication became unreliable was a threshold crossing. Communities that had depended on those networks for everything from emergency coordination to economic function suddenly had to operate with much less information about what was happening elsewhere. This shift toward localized knowledge and decision-making is one of the structural transitions that the law traces from the pre-Ark to the post-Ark world, and it continues to shape the current period in significant ways. The pre-Ark world had developed a complex relationship with artificial intelligence and automated systems that is relevant to how people in the post-Ark world think about technology. The law suggests that before the collapse, there was already significant tension between those who saw increasing automation as a solution to various problems and those who saw it as a source of new risks. That debate was never resolved, and its traces show up in the ways different factions in the current world relate to the technological remnants of the pre-Ark period. Some treat pre-Ark automation systems as resources to be reclaimed and redeployed. Others view them with deep suspicion, particularly given what the Ark themselves suggest about the relationship between machines and destruction. The financial and economic systems of the pre-Ark world are referenced in the law in ways that illuminate the current barter and salvage economy of the underground. The transition from a complex, abstracted economy built on global exchange to a local economy built on direct possession and immediate utility was one of the most disorienting aspects of the collapse for survivors from the pre-Ark period. The law traces this through the ways older survivors talk about value, what things are worth, how exchange works, versus how younger underground-born people understand those same concepts. These are not just economic differences. they reflect fundamentally different relationships to security, to the future, and to what it means to own something. The animals and ecosystems of the pre-arc surface world are referenced in the lore through what survived and what did not. The current surface ecology is changed in ways that the lore attributes both to the arc's activity and to the preceding environmental pressures of the pre-arc period. Some species persisted because they were adaptable. Others that would have been protected and managed in the old world simply did not have the infrastructure supporting them once the collapse happened. The raiders encounter traces of both the old ecology and the new one, and the lore uses these encounters to sketch a picture of a surface world that is genuinely different from what was there before, not just damaged but altered. The physical geography of the surface, by the time the current story takes place, has been modified by both the arc's activities and the passage of time since the collapse. But the pre-arc geography is still legible beneath those modifications. The street grids, the property boundaries, the deliberate shaping of the landscape by human engineering all persist as an underlying structure. Raiders who know how to read that landscape can use pre-arc geographic knowledge to orient themselves, to find resources, to avoid hazards. This ability to read the present through the past is a skill that the lore values explicitly, and it connects the current survival story back to the pre-arc world in a practical, physical way. The personal stories embedded in the pre-arc lore fragments are individually modest in scale. They are not, for the most part, about important people doing important things. They are about ordinary people navigating an extraordinary situation with the tools and knowledge and relationships they happen to have. A researcher who kept working through the night because they thought they had found something significant. A parent who made a call that would determine whether their family had access to a shelter. A technician who noticed something wrong with the system and tried to report it through channels that were no longer functioning. These stories are not heroic, they are human, and that quality of humanness is what makes the pre-arc period feel like a real past rather than a constructed backdrop. The music and sound environments preserved in certain underground zones carry traces of the pre-arc world in ways that are emotionally potent without being manipulative. The lore suggests that audio archives were among the things prioritized for preservation, partly for practical reasons, training, documentation, and partly because the people making preservation decisions understood something about how music functions as cultural memory. The sounds of the pre-arc world are present in the Arc Raiders' environment in fragmented, mediated form, and they carry the weight of that presence quietly, without announcement. The religious and philosophical traditions of the pre-arc world are represented in the lore through their persistence and transformation in the underground period. Different traditions responded to the collapse in different ways. Some found the collapse to be evidence for frameworks they already held. Others found that the collapse required a fundamental rethinking of their core commitments. The lore traces these responses through the belief systems of current characters and factions, showing both the continuity and the rupture between pre-arc and post-arc spiritual life. This is handled with a seriousness that avoids both dismissiveness and sentimentality. The energy systems of the pre-arc world, the power generation and distribution infrastructure that kept modern civilization functioning, are central to the current salvage economy in ways that the lore makes explicit. The knowledge of how to repair and operate pre-arc power systems is extraordinarily valuable in the underground. People who carry that knowledge have a form of power that transcends faction affiliation. The lore suggests that access to reliable power is one of the primary drivers of the current period's politics, and that the roots of that dynamic go all the way back to the infrastructure investments and vulnerabilities of the pre-arc world. The pre-arc world's relationship with the concept of the future, its investments, its plans, its confidence about what tomorrow would look like, is one of the things the lore handles most effectively through indirection. The abandoned, future-oriented projects on the surface, the long-term plans referenced in recovered documents, the infrastructures built to last generations rather than years, all of these point toward a world that genuinely expected to continue. That expectation was not naive. It was based on reasonable evidence about how the world had worked up to that point. The collapse of that expectation is one of the deepest cuts the lore makes, and it runs throughout the entire Ark Raiders story. The children born in the final years before the Ark arrived occupy a particular place in the current lore. These would now be young adults who grew up entirely in the underground, whose only knowledge of the surface world comes from the stories of others and whatever fragments of documentation survived. The lore is attentive to the ways this shapes their relationship to the pre-Ark world, how it is present for them as something almost mythological, a place of warmth and light that exists in other people's memories, but not in their own direct experience. This dynamic between experienced memory and inherited memory of the pre-Ark world is one of the quieter but more powerful threads in the current faction dynamics. The pre-Ark world's approach to risk, its systems for managing and distributing the consequences of large-scale catastrophes, is reflected in the lore through the survival disparities of the collapse period. The people who entered the underground alive were disproportionately those who had access to information, resources, and infrastructure that most people did not have. The lore does not make this point polemically, but it makes it clearly. The social composition of the surviving underground population reflects the inequalities of the pre-Ark world. Those inequalities did not vanish. They were carried underground and in many ways intensified, because survival conditions make differences in resources and knowledge more immediately consequential, not less. The pre-Ark world had developed, by the time of the Ark's arrival, a significant capacity for orbital observation and monitoring. This is relevant because several lore sources suggest that the first truly unambiguous evidence that something was coming was captured by orbital systems and not immediately shared through normal channels. The gap between what was known at the orbital level and what was communicated to ground-based populations and governments is one of the most contested aspects of the pre-Ark period, at least within the current underground communities where that history is still debated. Whether that gap was the result of institutional failure, deliberate withholding, or the chaos of a fragmenting system is a question the lore leaves open. The concept of home, as it appears throughout the Ark Raiders lore, is rooted in the pre-Ark world, even when the people invoking it have never experienced that world directly. Home means the surface. It means open sky. It means the particular quality of light and weather and space that no underground environment can fully reproduce. The lore traces this longing across generations, from people who lost a specific home to people who inherited a concept of home they have never actually experienced. It is one of the motivations that the lore suggests drives raiders onto the surface, beyond material necessity and into something closer to psychological need. The surface is not just a place to find resources, was effectively certain, and the question was effectively certain, and the question of response had collapsed into the question of survival, is described in the lore through its aftermath, rather than through direct accounts. The physical evidence of rapid, panicked decision-making, the abandoned plans, the structures modified in haste, the supplies cached and then never retrieved, tells a story that is more honest than any official record would be. The lore uses this physical evidence to suggest the texture of those final days without dramatizing them, which is more powerful than dramatization would be. The pre-Ark world ends not with a single moment, but with a transition that took long enough for people to experience in stages. The lore is careful about this. The Ark did not arrive, and then the old world was over. The old world was already changing before the Ark arrived, and the arrival accelerated and completed a process that was in some sense already underway. This complicates simple narratives of before and after, which is probably why the lore insists on it. The story of the pre-Ark world is not a golden age lost to a sudden catastrophe. It is a world with its own serious problems that encountered an additional problem it was not equipped to survive. That framing makes the story harder and more honest and ultimately more affecting. Chapter 2: The Descent. When the Ark arrived. The arrival of the Ark at Earth is the central event around which all of Ark Raider's lore is organised, but it's also one of the most deliberately fragmented and incompletely documented events in the entire narrative. This is not a storytelling failure. It is a storytelling choice, and a defensible one. The people who might have produced comprehensive accounts of the arrival were mostly overwhelmed by it rather than observing it. The records that do exist from this period are partial, traumatized, and contradictory in ways that are consistent with how records always look when they emerge from moments of maximum chaos and collapse. The first confirmed contact between human forces and Ark units, according to the most commonly cited lore fragments, did not take the form that most pre-Ark planners had anticipated. The military and defense frameworks developed before the arrival had modelled a range of scenarios, but the specific pattern of the Ark's initial engagement, the way they moved, the targets they prioritised, the pace and distribution of their activity, did not map cleanly onto any of those models. This mismatch between the anticipated threat and the actual threat is one of the first things the lore establishes about the Ark as an adversary. They are not hostile in the way that human adversaries are hostile. Their behaviour follows a different logic. The scale of the Ark's arrival is one of the things that is hardest to convey through lore fragments alone, but several sources attempt it through reference to visual observations in the first hours of atmospheric entry. The description of the sky during that period, pulled from survivor accounts and preserved records, points towards something that was simultaneously spectacular and terrifying in a way that initially created as much awe as fear. The Ark did not arrive as a military force arrives, with aggression and noise. They arrived with a quality that multiple accounts describe as almost indifferent, as if Earth were an obstacle to be managed rather than a target to be destroyed. The specific trajectory and distribution of the Ark's initial deployment is discussed in several lore sources in ways that suggest the landing pattern was not random. The concentration of early Ark activity in certain geographic areas, and the relative sparing of others, at least initially, points toward a selection process that the lore leaves without definitive explanation. One reading is that the Ark targeted areas with specific resource characteristics. Another reading suggests the pattern reflects the Ark's own navigational logic, approaching from specific orbital positions and following gravity and terrain in ways that produced a non-random distribution by default. A third reading, less discussed but present in at least some sources, suggests the initial deployment reflected intelligence gathered during the approach period, which would imply something about the Ark's capacity for observation and planning. The first human military engagements with the Ark are documented in enough detail across the lore to sketch a general picture of what they were like. The engagement pattern was characterized by a significant mismatch in offensive and defensive capacity that was apparent almost from the first contact. Human weapons systems were not ineffective against individual Ark units. They could damage Ark units and in some cases destroy them. The problem, as the lore makes clear, was scale and replacement rate. The Ark's ability to sustain losses and continue operating far exceeded the defensive capacity of any military force that engaged them. This asymmetry defined the character of the conflict from its very early stages. The civilian experience of the Ark's arrival is documented most richly in the personal logs and communications that survived the period, and it was profoundly shaped by the collapse of normal information systems. In the hours and days following the initial Ark contact, the communication networks that people had relied on for real-time information about events were fragmenting. Different communities had radically different information about what was happening. Some had direct visual contact with Ark units, and were responding to immediate physical threat. Others were receiving fragmented, contradictory reports through systems that were already degraded. Others still were effectively isolated, with no information at all beyond what they could observe directly. This information fragmentation is one of the early consequences of the Ark's arrival that the law emphasizes repeatedly. The behavior of Ark units during the initial contact phase is described in ways that consistently point toward a purpose other than simple destruction. Ark units did cause enormous destruction in this period, but the pattern of that destruction, as described in law sources, suggests that destruction was a byproduct of their activity rather than an end in itself. They did not target population centers the way a military force seeking to break the will of an opponent would. They moved through populated areas in ways that caused massive civilian casualties, but the casualties appeared incidental to a primary objective that was oriented towards something else. What that something else was in the initial contact phase is one of the enduring questions of the Ark Raiders lore. The government and institutional responses to the initial Ark arrival varied enormously across regions, and the lore traces these variations without attempting to synthesize them into a single narrative. In some areas, pre-established emergency protocols were activated and functioned more or less as intended, channeling survivors toward shelter facilities and organizing whatever defensive capacity existed. In other areas, the institutional response collapsed almost immediately, either because the Ark's activity directly disrupted the command and control structures that would have organized a response, or because the scale of the situation overwhelmed the assumptions built into those structures. The law suggests that the quality of immediate institutional response was one of the most significant variables in who survived the initial days. The people who were in orbit at the time of the Ark's arrival occupied a uniquely terrible position. Orbital platforms and stations were not the Ark's initial priority in the surface engagement phase, but they were not safe either. The law references the experiences of orbital personnel in ways that point toward a period of forced observation without capacity for action. The people watching from orbit could see the scale of what was happening on the surface in a way that ground-level observers could not. The records from that period, where they exist, have a quality of horrified witness that is different from the records produced by people who were in the middle of the events they were describing. The Ark units themselves, as first observed during the arrival and initial contact phase, are described in the lore with a consistency that suggests observers were genuinely trying to document what they were seeing despite everything else that was happening. The physical descriptions of Ark units from this period establish characteristics that remain consistent with later lore: the mechanical quality, the apparent absence of biological components, the behavior patterns that suggest autonomy but not improvisation, the signatures that various instruments could detect but not fully characterize. These early observations form the basis of the ongoing analysis of Ark behavior that continues into the current period of the story. Had been built for other purposes, for continuity of government, for civil defense, for wealthy clients seeking security, became the primary survival infrastructure during the early stages of the collapse. The law traces the process by which access to these facilities was negotiated and sometimes fought over during the chaos of the initial period. These negotiations, which took place under conditions of extreme stress and incomplete information, established some of the foundational social and political dynamics of the underground period that followed. The collapse of surface communications infrastructure during the Ark's initial activities had consequences that extended well beyond the immediate loss of information access. Communication networks were not just channels for information, they were the nervous system of the economic and logistical systems that kept modern populations alive. When those networks failed, the supply chains they coordinated also failed. The distribution of food, medicine, fuel, and other essentials, which depended on constant information flow to function, broke down in ways that compounded the direct effects of arc activity. The law suggests that many of the deaths in the early post-arrival period were not directly caused by arc units, but by the cascading failure of supply systems that had no redundancy for a breakdown of this kind. The first generation of underground organization, meaning the social structures that emerged in the initial shelter period immediately following the arc's arrival, is described in the law as both more resourceful and more conflictual than later mythology tends to suggest. The narrative of initial solidarity, followed by later fragmentation, is not quite accurate according to the law. The initial shelter period was characterized by real community building and real conflict happening simultaneously. The scarcity conditions of the early underground, combined with the trauma of the arrival period and the uncertainty about what was happening on the surface, created an environment where both the best and worst aspects of human social behavior were expressed at high intensity. The arc's movement patterns during the weeks and months following their initial arrival suggest, by most readings of the law, a systematic rather than opportunistic approach to their activity on Earth's surface. They did not behave like an invading force establishing and consolidating territory. They moved in patterns that seemed oriented towards specific objectives, completing whatever activity characterized those objectives, and then moving on, or concentrating in particular zones. This behavior is one of the main sources of evidence for the interpretation that the arc are engaged in some kind of resource extraction or transformation activity rather than a war of conquest in any traditional sense. The survivors who made it through the initial arc arrival period and into the first phase of underground survival are the people whose experiences and decisions define the early underground communities. The law engages with these first-generation survivors with a mixture of admiration and unflinching honesty. These were people operating under conditions of maximum stress with minimal information, making decisions with enormous consequences based on incomplete understanding of the situation. Not all of those decisions were good. Not all of the people making them were good. The communities that formed in this period reflect that reality, carrying both the genuinely heroic aspects of the initial survival effort and the compromises and failures that are inseparable from survival under extreme conditions. The technological response to the arc, during and after their initial arrival, took several different forms across the law's account of this period. At one end of the spectrum, there were conventional military applications of existing weapons systems, modified and adapted as quickly as possible for use against arc units. At the other end, there were more experimental approaches, attempts to understand the arc's technology well enough to use it against them, or to develop entirely new systems designed specifically for the arc threat. The law suggests that both approaches produced partial results, enough to keep the situation from being immediately terminal, but not enough to reverse it. The arc units encountered during the initial arrival and contact phase appear, by most readings of the law, to represent only a subset of the full range of archetypes that would later become known. The initial deployment was dominated by what later analysis characterized as clearing and preparation units, archetypes optimized for dealing with surface obstacles to whatever the primary arc activity was. The existence of this type specialization, apparent even in the early law from the arrival period, points toward the interpretation that the arc's presence on Earth was organized around a specific set of objectives that required different types of units for different tasks. The natural environment's response to the initial arc activity is one of the law threads that points toward the arc's impact being more than just physical destruction. The changes in local flora and fauna documented in early post-arrival reports, the alterations in soil chemistry, water quality, and air composition in areas of concentrated arc activity, suggest that the arc's presence had biological as well as physical effects on the environment. Whether these effects were incidental consequences of arc activity or part of its deliberate purpose is a question that the law keeps open. But their existence is well documented enough in the available sources to be treated as established rather than speculative. The psychological impact of the ark's arrival on the surviving population is traced in the law through the belief systems, social structures, and individual behaviours that emerged in the immediate post-arrival period. Trauma responses, community support systems, and various forms of meaning-making in response to the collapse are all documented in ways that resist simplification. People responded to the same events in radically different ways, shaped by their pre-existing beliefs, their specific experiences during the arrival, and the communities they found themselves in during the immediate aftermath. The diversity of psychological and cultural responses to the ark's arrival is one of the things that makes the underground world of the current period rich and complicated. The questions of blame and responsibility that emerged in the early post-arrival period are documented in the law primarily through their persistence into the current period as live political issues. Who knew what and when? What could have been done differently? Which decisions in the pre-arc period made the collapse worse than it needed to be? These questions were being asked immediately after the arrival, and they are still being asked in the current period with more information, but no more consensus. The law treats these as genuine, open questions rather than settled judgments, which is the appropriate approach given the fragmentary nature of the available evidence. The first interactions between different underground communities in the post-arrival period helped establish the patterns of alliance and conflict that would define the subsequent decades. Groups that shared shelter facilities had to negotiate coexistence under conditions where every resource question had life or death stakes. Groups that were geographically separated tried to establish communication and cooperation across a surface that was no longer safe to cross. These early interactions, with all of their tension and their occasional genuine solidarity, are documented in the law as the origin points of the faction dynamics that define the current period. The ark's behaviour toward infrastructure during the initial period was not uniformly destructive. The law contains references to instances where arc units moved through or past infrastructure without damaging it, and other instances where they appeared to modify existing structures rather than destroy them. These anomalies in the destruction pattern are some of the most discussed aspects of the arrival period in current underground scholarship, because they potentially reveal something about the logic behind arc activity that pure destruction patterns cannot. The question of why certain things were left intact and others were not is one that different factions in the current period have very different answers to. The role of specific individuals in organising the early survival response is a complex topic in the law, partly because the urgency of the survival situation meant that leadership often emerged informally and was exercised without documentation, and partly because the mythology of the early period has been shaped by the political interests of later factions. The law is careful to note when a particular narrative about the arrival period seems to serve a particular faction's current interests, without necessarily dismissing the underlying facts. The history of the arrival period is both genuinely important and genuinely contested in ways that are inseparable from current politics. The physical changes to the surface environment that began during the initial arc contact period are documented in the law as one of the most significant long-term consequences of the ark's presence. The alterations in landscape, vegetation, and atmospheric conditions in zones of concentrated arc activity establish baseline conditions for the surface world that raids currently operate in. Understanding what the surface looks like in the early post-arrival period versus what it looks like now points toward ongoing arc activity as the primary driver of continued surface change, rather than just the accumulated aftermath of the initial arrival. The food and water situation during the initial underground period is described in the law with a directness that reflects the severity of the immediate survival challenges. The shelter facilities that received survivors had resources calibrated for expected occupancy levels that were, in many cases, significantly exceeded by the actual number of people who arrived. The gap between available resources and actual need in the first months was managed through a combination of extreme rationing, rapid improvisation of alternative food and water sources, and, in some documented cases, decisions about allocation that the law does not shy away from describing as morally compromised. The survival emergency of the initial post-arrival period was not a context in which clean ethical choices were always available. The ARC unit's apparent lack of concern with underground facilities, at least in the initial period, is one of the most discussed aspects of their behaviour in the early law. The shelters where survivors had gathered were known in at least some cases to contain significant numbers of people, and ARC units that were operating in the vicinity of those shelters did not systematically target them. This was not absolute, and there are law references to shelter facilities being discovered and destroyed. But the general pattern of relative underground safety in the early period was consistent enough to become the foundational assumption of the underground civilization that developed subsequently. The law keeps the question of whether this relative safety was incidental or deliberate carefully open. The development of early communication systems between underground communities was one of the most significant technical achievements of the initial post-arrival period, and the law traces it in ways that show both the ingenuity and the limitations involved. Using pre-ARC infrastructure where it remained functional, improvising alternatives where it did not, and eventually developing new systems using salvaged ARC technology and pre-ARC materials, the underground communities gradually rebuilt a communication network that was more limited in range and reliability than what had existed before, but was functional enough to begin coordinating survival activities across geographic separation. The first expeditions back to the surface after the initial ARC arrival period are documented in the law as some of the most dangerous and consequential activities of the early post-ARC period. People were needed on the surface for several reasons: to assess the situation, to retrieve cached resources, to maintain what communication infrastructure remained above ground, and simply to understand what the world above them had become. The accounts of these early surface excursions are among the most vivid documents in the ARC Raiders Law Archive, both because they were carefully recorded as important intelligence, and because the people making them were operating in conditions of intense uncertainty and danger. The ARC's activity on the surface during the initial months following the arrival settled into patterns that would define the ongoing surface conflict. The areas of highest ARC concentration, the movement corridors they used, the structures they created or modified, the resources they appeared to prioritize, all began to be mapped and analyzed by the underground communities. This intelligence gathering was the foundation of the raider operations that would later become institutionalized, and its origins in the desperate information seeking of the early post-arrival period are preserved in the law as part of the raider tradition's founding mythology. The political economy of the early underground period is traced in the law through the ways pre-ARC resources were catalogued, distributed, and eventually used as the basis for the emerging post-ARC social hierarchy. People who had entered the underground with significant pre-ARC resources, whether in the form of physical supplies, technical knowledge, or established social networks, had significant advantages in the early underground period. The law is attentive to the ways these initial advantages were sometimes leveraged into permanent structural power, and how that dynamic created the fault lines between different groups that persist into the current period. The children born in the underground during and immediately after the ARC's arrival represent a specific cohort in the law's social analysis. These are the people who entered the world in conditions of maximum disruption and scarcity, whose earliest experiences were shaped by emergency rather than stability. The law traces how this formative experience shaped a generation that is both more adaptive and more comfortable with precarity than those who remembered the surface world. These individuals, now adults in the current period, occupy a distinctive position in the underground communities, and their attitudes toward risk, toward the surface, and toward the Ark itself differ in notable ways from those of the older generations. The first glimpses of Ark technology, examined closely by human researchers in the post-arrival period, generated a body of analysis that is referenced throughout the later lore as the foundation of technical understanding of the Ark. The researchers who produced this analysis were working under extremely difficult conditions, with limited equipment, limited safety, and the constant pressure of the survival emergency around them. What they produced was necessarily incomplete and in some cases incorrect, but it established a framework for thinking about Ark technology that influenced everything that followed. The law treats these early analyses with the respect due to pioneering work produced under impossible conditions. The arrival period's effect on the human understanding of what the Ark actually are is one of the most consequential outcomes of the initial contact phase. Before the arrival, the Ark were understood as an unknown external threat of ambiguous nature. After the arrival, they were understood as something specific, even if that something was not fully comprehensible. The physical reality of Ark units, their behavior, their apparent purposes, and their relationship to each other, and to some kind of organizing intelligence or system, became the primary intellectual preoccupation of the people trying to understand what had happened to their world and what could be done about it. The social structures that emerged in different underground communities during the initial post-arrival period reflect the full range of pre-Ark social organization adapted to survival conditions. In some communities, pre-existing hierarchies reasserted themselves with modifications for the new context. In others, the collapse of pre-Ark institutions created space for new forms of social organization to develop. In others still, the pressures of the survival situation produced ad hoc arrangements that were too pragmatic to qualify as any established social form. The law treats this diversity as a genuine feature of the period rather than a problem to be resolved, and the diversity persists into the current period as one of the sources of interfaction complexity. The memories people carry of the arrival period are, by the current time of the story, complicated by the passage of years and the work that memory has done in the intervening period. The law is aware of this, and it treats first-person accounts of the arrival with appropriate interpretive caution. Not because the people offering them are dishonest, but because memory under extreme conditions is never simply a recording. The accounts of the arrival preserved in current law are shaped by everything that happened afterward, and understanding them requires holding that shaping process in view. The Ark unit's characteristic signatures, the sounds, the visual patterns, the instrumental readings that define them in the current game environment, appear in their earliest documented forms in accounts from the arrival period. There is something particular about encountering these familiar characteristics described in the context of first observation, before they had been categorized and understood and responded to as well as they are now. The law uses this contrast between then and now to create a sense of accumulated human understanding that has been built at enormous cost. The role of chance and contingency in determining who survived the arrival period is one of the law threads that resists the narrative tendency to find order and meaning in survival. Many of the people who survived did so because of circumstances that had nothing to do with their preparation or their decisions. Many people who were well prepared did not survive because of circumstances equally outside their control. The law registers this uncomfortable truth through the specifics of individual survival stories, which often turn on factors of proximity, timing, and luck as much as preparation and intelligence. The early Ark Raiders lore is most explicit about the psychological impact of the first visual encounters with Ark units on the people experiencing them. The accounts describe a quality of wrongness that went beyond fear into something more fundamental, a response to the encounter with something that was both mechanical and purposeful in a way that seemed to violate some basic assumption about the nature of the world. This response is documented across many different accounts, in consistent enough terms to suggest it reflects a genuine common experience rather than a stylized retrospective construction. The infrastructure decisions made in the immediate post-arrival period about which underground facilities to maintain and expand and which to abandon, about which surface routes to attempt to keep open and which to write off, about where to concentrate the limited engineering capacity available, had long-term consequences that shaped the geographic distribution of current underground civilization. The lore traces these early decisions and their consequences through the physical layout of current settlements, which reflects both deliberate planning and the constraints imposed by early choices made in conditions of extreme pressure. The relationship between the underground communities and the surface world in the immediate post-arrival period was defined by the Ark's activity on the surface in ways that created a set of rules and constraints that the Raider tradition later developed. What was safe? What was possible? What was worth the risk? These assessments were made first by necessity rather than choice, by people who had to go to the surface because they had no alternative, and what they learned from those early forced excursions formed the knowledge base that Raider culture was built on. The first clear evidence that the Ark were engaged in some form of systematic activity on the surface, rather than simply making the surface uninhabitable, came in the early post-arrival period, through observations made by the first surface excursion teams, the structures the Ark were building or modifying, the patterns of resource movement their activity implied, and the consistency of their behaviour across different geographic areas all pointed toward a program with specific objectives. This recognition that the Ark were doing something, and not just destroying, was one of the pivotal intellectual moments of the early post-Ark period, and the lore marks it as such. The arrival period's documentation, fragmentary and inconsistent as it is, represents one of the most important bodies of evidence available to anyone trying to understand the Ark. The events of those initial days and weeks contain information about Ark behaviour in a context of first contact that is not reproducible and not otherwise available. The current period's researchers and faction analysts work extensively with arrival period documentation precisely because it captures something about the Ark that later, more familiar encounters cannot, which is the first response of an unprepared civilization to something genuinely unprecedented. The loss of life during the Ark's initial arrival and the first months of post-arrival chaos is described in the lore with a restraint that is more powerful than any attempt at quantification. The scale of loss was not something the available documentation could fully capture, and the lore seems to understand that attempting to enumerate it would be both inaccurate and reductive. The void left by that loss is instead registered through its effects on the social fabric of the surviving communities, through the specific absences that shaped the early underground world, and through the ways the people who survived organised their lives around the fact of what they had lost. The Ark's arrival period closes in the lore's implied chronology, not with a definitive endpoint but with the settling of the situation into a new kind of stability. The immediate crisis of the arrival gave way to the ongoing crisis of Ark occupation, and the underground communities transitioned from emergency response mode into a longer-term survival posture. This transition is marked in the lore by the emergence of more organised social structures, more systematic approaches to the surface, and the beginnings of the faction dynamics that would define the subsequent period. The arrival period was over. The occupation period had begun. Chapter 3. The architecture of the underground. The underground civilization that developed in the years following the Ark's arrival was not a single, unified entity. The law is consistent and explicit about this from the earliest post-arrival period forward. The shelters and tunnel networks that survivors occupied were geographically dispersed, physically isolated in many cases, and populated by communities with different histories, different resources, and different ideas about how to organize collective life under extraordinary conditions. What eventually emerged from this dispersed beginning was a complex patchwork of communities, alliances, tensions, and cultural identities that the current period of Ark Raiders lore reflects in the form of its various factions. The physical structure of the underground was determined primarily by pre-existing facilities rather than new construction, at least in the initial period. The continuity of government bunkers, the commercial shelter developments, the utility tunnels and subway systems, the industrial underground facilities that various industries had built for their own purposes, all became nodes of the expanding underground network. The lore traces how these very different kinds of spaces shaped the communities that occupied them. A community that started in a well-supplied government facility had a different early experience and developed different institutional forms than one that started in a repurposed industrial tunnel with limited resources. The expansion of underground space in the post-arrival period was a continuous process that the lore frames as one of the defining engineering challenges of the New World, extending the existing tunnel networks, connecting isolated facilities, creating new space in areas where surface activity made above-ground construction impossible, required both technical skill and organized labor. The management of these engineering projects was one of the first things that required communities to develop governance structures that went beyond immediate crisis management. How decisions were made about where to expand and how to allocate the resources required for expansion became one of the foundational political questions of the early underground period. The resource economy of the underground was shaped from the beginning by the fundamental challenge of providing for human needs without access to the surface production systems that had previously generated most of what people consumed. Food production, water processing, air management, waste handling, energy generation, all of these had to be accomplished with pre-Ark technology and supplies, supplemented by whatever could be salvaged from the surface at enormous risk. The lore traces the development of underground resource management systems in ways that show both the impressive adaptability of the communities involved and the real suffering imposed by the constraints they were working within. The political structures that emerged in different underground communities are described in the lore with a complexity that resists simple categorization. In some communities, pre-existing hierarchies from the pre-Ark world reasserted themselves in modified form. In others, the conditions of the early underground period provided an opportunity for genuinely new forms of social organization to develop. In others, the immediate authority of whoever controlled critical resources, food, water, medical supplies, energy, became the de facto basis of political power, regardless of any formal legitimacy claims. The lore does not evaluate these different approaches ideologically, it traces their consequences. The social stratification of underground communities, as documented in the lore, reflects both the inequalities carried over from the pre-Ark world and the new inequalities generated by underground conditions. Technical knowledge was extraordinarily valuable, elevating people who had been unremarkable in the pre-Ark world to positions of significant social importance. Conversely, forms of status that had been important in the pre-Ark world lost much of their meaning when the systems that generated that status no longer existed. The resulting social landscape was familiar enough to cause friction at points of contact with old hierarchies, and strange enough to generate its own new tensions. The children born entirely in the underground represent the first generation that did not have to reconcile the surface world with the underground world, because the surface world was never part of their direct experience. The law is attentive to the ways this shapes their psychology, their social behaviours, and their relationship to the ongoing conflict with the Ark. These individuals are the most fully adapted to underground life, in the sense of having no experiential baseline to compare it to. But the law also suggests that this adaptation comes with its own costs, particularly in the form of a relationship to the surface world that is entirely mediated through other people's accounts and whatever physical evidence the raiders bring back. The role of raiders in underground society is one of the central topics of Ark Raiders lore, and the law approaches it with a recognition that raider operations are both economically essential to underground survival and socially ambiguous in their position. Raiders provide the salvage that the underground economy depends on. They gather intelligence about the surface that shapes community decision-making. They are, in a very real sense, the primary interface between the underground world and the surface world. But they are also people who regularly break the primary safety rule of underground civilization, the rule that says the surface is too dangerous to be worth the risk, and who do so in ways that make that rule look like a suggestion rather than a law. The relationship between different underground communities was not simply one of cooperation united against a common threat. The law is clear that inter-community politics was as complex, contentious, and sometimes as violent as any pre-Ark political environment. The common threat of the Ark provided a shared context but not a shared agenda. Communities competed for resources, for territory, for the best salvage routes, for technical expertise, for information. The current faction structure of Ark Raiders reflects these ongoing competitions and the alliances that formed in response to them, and understanding the faction dynamics requires understanding that the Ark is not the only, or even always the primary source of conflict in the current period. The medical challenges of the underground period are documented in the lore in ways that trace the enormous consequences of operating in an isolated environment without reliable access to the full range of pre-Ark medical capability. The knowledge to treat many conditions was available, carried underground by surviving medical professionals. But the materials required to translate that knowledge into treatment were progressively depleted and increasingly difficult to replace from surface salvage. The medical economy of the underground, the management and distribution of medical supplies, was one of the most politically charged aspects of underground life, because the stakes were literally the health and survival of individual community members. The development of underground food production systems is one of the more positive threads in the early underground lore. The necessity of producing food in environments without natural light, with limited space and resources, stimulated significant innovation in areas of hydroponics, fungiculture, insect farming, and other food production methods that had existed in limited form in the pre-Ark world. The lore traces this development with what seems like genuine appreciation for the ingenuity involved, and the current underground food systems, whatever their limitations, are presented as genuine achievements of the post-Ark adaptation period. The psychological health challenges of underground living are addressed in the lore with a seriousness that reflects their real importance to community stability. The loss of natural light, the physical confinement, the constant low-level stress of survival conditions, the social intensity of communities that could not disperse pressure by separating, all of these created conditions that were psychologically difficult for significant portions of the underground population. The communities that developed effective support systems for managing these challenges were measurably more stable and effective than those that treated psychological health as a secondary concern. The law documents this with enough specificity to suggest it reflects real research into the psychology of isolated communities under stress. The education systems that developed in the underground represent one of the clearest examples of communities making long-term investments despite short-term scarcity. Teaching children and young adults not only the immediate practical skills required for underground survival, but also the broader body of knowledge that would be required to maintain a functional civilization over generations, was recognized early as a survival-level priority. The specific content of underground education, what was included and what was excluded, what was considered essential and what was treated as luxury, is itself a form of evidence about the values and priorities of the communities that developed these systems. The cultural life of underground communities is documented in the law through the various forms of creative and social expression that developed in the post-arc period. Music, storytelling, visual art, games, rituals, both religious and secular, all maintained and developed in underground conditions in ways that reflect the fundamental human need for culture, regardless of material circumstances. The law treats this cultural vitality not as a surprising thing given the conditions, but as an expected and important part of how communities maintain cohesion and meaning. The cultural products of the underground period are some of the most human and affecting materials in the Ark Raiders Law Archive. The communication technology development of the underground period is traced in the law as a continuous process of rebuilding capability from degraded starting points. The pre-Ark communication infrastructure that survived in functional form was progressively extended and supplemented by systems built from salvaged materials and pre-Ark technical knowledge. The development of reliable communication between underground communities transformed the political landscape of the post-Ark period, enabling the formation of alliances and the coordination of activity across geographic separation in ways that were not possible when communities were more isolated. The governance of raider operations as a formal activity, distinct from individual scavenging, is identified in the law as one of the major institutional developments of the Middle Post-Ark period. The transition from informal individual surface excursions to organized raider operations with systematic intelligence gathering, shared equipment, and coordinated deployment represents a significant increase in the sophistication of the underground's relationship with the surface. The law traces this development and identifies it as one of the key enabling factors in the expansion of underground settlements beyond what individual scavenging could have supported. The relationship between technical specialists and generalist community members in underground society is one of the recurring social tensions documented in the law. The dependence of communities on specialized technical knowledge for power systems, for food production, for medical care, for communication, created a form of social leverage for technical specialists that sometimes expressed itself in ways the broader community found uncomfortable. The law traces how different communities manage this tension through contractual arrangements, through training programs designed to distribute technical knowledge more broadly, and in some cases through forms of coercion that the law notes without endorsing. The Ark's activity on the surface during the Middle Post-Ark period is described in the law as becoming more organized and more obviously systematic. The initial period of intensive, apparently exploratory activity gave way to what multiple law sources describe as a pattern of consolidation and construction. Ark units, building or modifying surface structures in ways that pointed toward long-term occupation rather than a temporary deployment. This shift in Ark behavior is one of the developments that most significantly affected underground planning and policy, because it shifted the framework from weathering a temporary storm to managing a permanent new reality The emergence of ideology as a divisive force within and between underground communities is traced in the law as a natural consequence of the extended post-arc period. In the immediate survival emergency, pragmatic questions dominated. As communities became more stable and survival less immediately precarious, there was more space for the larger questions of meaning and value that ideological difference addresses. The law documents the emergence of distinct ideological positions within the underground world, on questions ranging from the appropriate relationship with arc technology to the rights of different community members to the question of what the ultimate goal of underground civilization should be. The salvage economy's development into a complex and institutionalized system is one of the economic threads that the law traces through the middle post-arc period. What started as emergency scavenging became, over time, a sophisticated industry with its own specialists, its own infrastructure, its own social organization, and its own culture. The raider as a social and economic figure emerges from this development, and the law is attentive to both the economic function that raiders serve and the cultural identity that has developed around that function. The question of reproduction and population growth in the underground is addressed in the law as one of the fundamental policy questions of the post-arc period. Every underground community had to manage the relationship between its resource base and its population size. Communities that maintained stable population levels relative to resources survived and prospered. Communities that failed to manage this balance faced crises that, in some cases, proved fatal to the community's survival. The law does not prescribe any particular approach to this question, but it is clear-eyed about the consequences of getting the management of it wrong. The treatment of the elderly and disabled in underground communities is one of the ethical threads that runs through the post-arc law with a consistency that suggests it was a genuinely important issue for these communities. The resource constraints of underground life created pressure toward utilitarian approaches to care that conflicted with the values many community members brought with them from the pre-arc world. The law documents the range of positions different communities took on these questions and the consequences, social as well as practical, of different approaches. The underground community's relationship with pre-arc historical memory is one of the more subtle but important threads in the Arc Raiders lore. The question of how to remember and transmit knowledge of the pre-arc world to generations that had no direct experience of it was not just a sentimental question. It was, by many readings of the lore, a survival question. The pre-arc world contained enormous amounts of knowledge and technical capability that underground civilization depended on preserving and accessing. The systems developed for preserving and transmitting that knowledge were some of the most important cultural institutions of the post-arc period. The first inter-community conflicts that crossed the threshold from competition to open violence are documented in the lore as significant threshold events that shaped the political development of the underground world. The establishment of norms, however contested, for the management of inter-community conflict was one of the major political achievements of the post-arc period, because the alternative, unlimited intrahuman violence, compounded by the external arc threat, was obviously terminal for everyone involved. The mechanisms developed for managing conflict between communities and the histories of violence that preceded those mechanisms are preserved in the lore as important context for the current faction structure. The Arc's construction activity on the surface, as documented through Raider intelligence in the middle post-arc period, produced a body of information that fundamentally changed the underground community's understanding of what they were dealing with. The structures the Arc were building were not immediately comprehensible in terms of function, but their scale and consistency pointed towards something ambitious and long-term. The lore treats this growing recognition that the Arc were not passing through, but building, not disrupting, but constructing, as one of the most important intellectual and emotional developments of the post-arc period. The development of weapons and defensive technology designed specifically for arc engagement is traced in the lore as a parallel track to the ongoing survival and adaptation efforts of the underground communities. The knowledge generated by early researchers studying arc units was progressively applied to the development of tools and techniques for dealing with them. This development process was uneven, dependent on the resource base and technical capacity of different communities, and the lore suggests that the distribution of anti-arc technology was itself a significant source of inter-community political inequality. The myths and stories that underground communities developed about the arc reflect the range of interpretations that the available evidence supported and the emotional needs that different communities had. The arc were interpreted as punishment, as test, as cosmic indifference, as mechanical failure of a distant civilization, as gods, as demons. None of these interpretations could be definitively confirmed or refuted by the available evidence, and the lore treats them with the understanding that they served important social and psychological functions regardless of their factual accuracy. The persistence of these interpretations into the current period and the conflicts between communities holding different interpretive frameworks is one of the sources of ideological diversity in the faction structure. The engineering achievements of the underground period are celebrated in the lore through specific references to projects that expanded underground living capacity beyond what the pre-existing shelter infrastructure could support. New tunnel sections, new cavern spaces, underground rivers diverted for water supply, geothermal energy tapped for power generation. These are described as genuine accomplishments that deserve the recognition they receive in underground culture because they represent the successful application of pre-arc technical knowledge to entirely new problems under conditions that would have defeated less determined communities. The role of information in the post-arc political economy is traced in the lore as one of the major sources of power and inequality in the underground world. Communities that had better intelligence about surface conditions, about arc behavior, about the activities of other underground communities, had significant advantages in planning and decision-making. The systems developed for gathering, analyzing, and controlling the distribution of this intelligence were some of the most sophisticated political institutions of the post-arc period, and the lore traces their development as a significant thread in the overall story of underground civilization. The question of whether to pursue active resistance to the arc or passive survival was one of the most divisive political questions of the post-arc period, and the lore documents it without resolving it. The arguments for active resistance emphasized dignity, long-term viability, and the potential for reclaiming the surface world. The arguments for passive survival emphasized resource conservation, safety, and the realistic limits of what underground communities could achieve against an adversary of the arc's capability. Different communities took different positions on this spectrum, and the current faction structure reflects those historical differences. The development of the raider identity as a distinct cultural type within underground society is one of the more interesting social threads in the post-arc lore. Raiders occupied a unique social position, simultaneously essential to community survival and operating outside the normal structures of underground social life. For significant periods, the culture that developed around raider identity, its values, its aesthetics, its particular forms of solidarity and humour and fatalism is described in the lore with enough detail to suggest that it was a rich and genuinely distinct subculture rather than simply a job category. The underground period produced its own distinct forms of art and culture that were not simply adaptations of pre-arc cultural forms, but genuinely new things developed in response to the specific conditions of underground life. The visual languages, the musical traditions, the storytelling forms that emerged from underground communities carry traces of their origin conditions in ways that someone familiar with those conditions can read. The law uses these cultural products both as evidence of the richness of underground life and as diagnostic tools for understanding the values and experiences of the communities that produce them. The relationship between underground communities and the rare individuals who crossed between communities as traders, diplomats, and information carriers is traced in the law as one of the important connective tissues of the post-arc political world. These intermediary figures, who existed in all communities but were defined by their movement between them, played crucial roles in preventing the underground world from fragmenting completely into isolated, mutually hostile units. Their social position, trusted by no one completely and needed by everyone, is one of the more interesting features of the post-arc social landscape. The first generation of children born entirely in the underground, who grew to full adulthood and took on positions of social and political responsibility, is identified in the law as a significant transitional cohort. These were people who had grown up with no direct memory of the pre-arc world, had been shaped entirely by underground conditions and culture, and were making decisions about the future of communities for the first time, without the weight of personal loss and personal memory of what had been destroyed. The law is interested in what they decided to do differently and what they chose to maintain. The ecological management challenges of underground communities are addressed in the law as one of the less glamorous but genuinely important aspects of post-arc civilization. Maintaining the air quality, managing waste streams, controlling the biological environment of spaces that were never designed for permanent human habitation required continuous, technical attention and institutional management. The communities that got this right were healthier and more productive. The communities that failed to manage it faced chronic health problems and infrastructure degradation that compounded all their other challenges. The moral codes that developed in underground communities are documented in the law as both continuations of pre-arc ethical traditions and genuine innovations generated by the specific conditions of underground life. The situations that underground communities regularly faced, situations of resource scarcity, collective risk management, intensive social proximity, and ongoing conflict with an external threat, generated ethical questions that pre-arc moral frameworks were not always well equipped to address. The responses different communities developed to those questions are part of the ethical heritage that different factions carry into the current period. The late underground period, roughly corresponding to the time before the raider tradition had become fully institutionalized, is described in the law as a period of both consolidation and new instability. The communities that had survived the initial post-arc period had developed the institutions and cultures that would define them going forward, but the stabilization of those communities also meant that the inter-community tensions that had been managed through the urgency of the survival period began to express themselves more overtly. The late underground period saw both the development of the cooperation mechanisms that made the current faction structure possible and the conflicts that defined its fault lines. The arc's activity patterns on the surface by the late underground period had established themselves into something that raider intelligence could partially predict. The zones of highest activity, the movement corridors, the periods of relative quiescence. This partial predictability was enormously valuable to raider operations and to underground planning more broadly. The development of analytical frameworks for understanding arc behavior, building on the early observational work of the arrival period, was one of the major intellectual achievements of the post-arc period, even though those frameworks were always partial and sometimes dangerously wrong. The underground period closes in the implied chronology of the law, not with a single transition point, but with a gradual shift toward the more active and more outward-looking posture of the current period. The communities that had been primarily defensive and primarily inward-focused began to develop the capacity and the will for more sustained engagement with the surface world. This shift was driven by a combination of factors, including the development of better radar technology and doctrine, growing inter-community cooperation on surface operations, and the recognition that passive survival indefinitely was not a viable long-term strategy. The arc of the underground period, from emergency survival to sustainable civilization to the beginnings of reclamation, is one of the most fully developed narrative threads in the Ark Raiders lore. Chapter 4: The Factions and Their Wars. The faction structure that defines the current period of Ark Raiders lore is not a simple arrangement of clearly opposed groups. The lore resists that simplification from the beginning, presenting a political landscape where the boundaries between groups are contested, where alliances shift, where individuals and communities hold positions that do not map neatly onto any single faction's official ideology. Understanding the factions requires understanding both their historical origins, which reach back into the pre-Ark period and the early underground, and their current dynamics, which are shaped by present conditions as much as by historical legacy. The earliest identifiable faction precursors in the lore are not the fully developed organizations of the current period, but the coalitions and networks that formed in the early underground around shared interests, shared resources, or shared histories from the pre-Ark world. These early groupings were less ideologically coherent than current factions, and more nakedly organized around immediate material interests. Over time, as the underground period extended and communities had to articulate not just what they needed to survive, but what they were trying to build, these early groupings developed the ideological dimensions that distinguish the current factions from simple interest coalitions. The faction that most directly inherits from the pre-Ark governmental and institutional structures is described in the lore as one of the more internally contested groups in the current period. Its claim to legitimacy rests on continuity with pre-Ark authority, which carries weight for some community members and none at all for others. The people who find that claim meaningful tend to be those who believe that the institutional frameworks of the pre-Ark world, whatever their flaws, represented accumulated wisdom about governance and social organization that should not be discarded along with everything else that was lost. The people who reject it tend to see it as an attempt to restore a power structure that the collapse demonstrated was fundamentally inadequate. The faction that emerged most directly from the Raider tradition is characterized in the lore as intensely practical, experimentally minded, and deeply skeptical of authority that cannot justify itself in operational terms. Its culture is shaped by the Raider experience of the surface world, by the knowledge that survival on the surface requires accurate judgment unclouded by wishful thinking or institutional deference. This faction's politics are driven less by ideology than by a pragmatic framework that asks, does this work? Can it be tested? What does the evidence actually show? This approach has significant strengths and a characteristic blind spot, which is that not all important questions are questions that can be answered empirically. The faction with the strongest ideological investment in reclaiming the surface world is one of the more emotionally compelling groups in the current lore. Its founding story points toward people whose connection to the surface, either through direct memory or through the stories passed down by those who remembered it, was intense enough to refuse the premise that underground survival was an acceptable permanent condition. The lore presents this faction's conviction with a sympathy that does not prevent it from tracing the costs of that conviction, including the Raider casualties that result from prioritizing surface reclamation over operational caution. The faction that has most thoroughly developed a working relationship with Ark technology is one of the most intellectually interesting groups in the current lore. Its approach to the Ark is characterized by a refusal to treat the Ark as simply hostile, and by an intense curiosity about what the Ark actually are and what they actually want. The lore traces the development of this faction's position from early researchers who made the practical observation that ARC technology was worth studying and using, to a current ideological stance that includes more speculative elements about the ARC's nature and purpose that not everyone in the broader underground community finds comfortable. The tension between different factions over the treatment of ARC technology is one of the most active political conflicts in the current period, and the law develops it with genuine complexity. The practical arguments for using ARC technology are strong. It is more capable than most pre-ARC technology in many applications. It is available on the surface in significant quantities, and understanding how it works is valuable, independent of any decision about whether to use it. The arguments against are also substantive. ARC technology may have effects that are not immediately visible. Using it may be read as collaboration or capitulation, and the communities that depend most heavily on it may become vulnerable if its behavior changes in ways they cannot predict or control. The faction dynamics around raider operations are particularly complex because raider operations affect and are affected by all of the major faction conflicts simultaneously. Raiders from different factions operate in the same surface zones, competing for the same salvage, navigating the same ARC activity patterns. The protocols and conventions that have developed for managing this simultaneous presence are a combination of practical necessities and ideological commitments, and the points where they break down are some of the most revealing moments in the current faction dynamics. The role of ideology versus pragmatism in faction decision-making is a recurring theme in the current period law. All factions have both ideological commitments and pragmatic interests, and the relationship between these two drives of action is a source of both internal coherence and internal conflict within each faction. The law is interested in the moments when these two drives come apart, when ideological commitment would require one course of action and pragmatic interest another, because those moments reveal the true priorities of the faction and often have significant consequences for the people involved. The treatment of outsiders, people who claim no faction, or who have crossed from one faction to another, is handled differently by different factions and is one of the markers of faction character in the law. Some factions treat faction membership as a relatively open category that individuals can enter and exit with reasonable freedom. Others treat it as a commitment that, once made, is effectively permanent, and treat those who have left as traitors, or, at best, as permanently suspect. The law traces how these different stances on membership and defection shape the internal cultures of different factions and their relationships with each other. The factions' relationships with the communities they claim to represent or lead are not uniform, and the law is attentive to the gap between faction leadership and the broader populations whose interests factions claim to champion. In some cases, faction ideology genuinely reflects the values of the community it speaks for. In others, there is a significant gap between the official positions of faction leadership and the practical concerns of ordinary community members. The law traces these gaps without simplifying them, recognizing that the relationship between leadership and community in any organization is complex and contested. The economic interests that underlie faction politics are documented in the law alongside the ideological ones, and the two are not always in alignment. A faction that has strong ideological commitments to a particular approach to ARC relations may also have economic interests that are complicated by that approach. A faction that is ideologically committed to surface reclamation may have community members whose livelihoods depend on the continuation of the underground economy, rather than its replacement by a surface one. These tensions between ideology and economic interest are sources of internal faction conflict that the law traces with appropriate attention. The role of individual leaders in shaping faction culture and direction is addressed in the law with a recognition that while structural factors are important, the specific decisions and personalities of key individuals have had genuine consequences for how factions developed. The founding figures of each faction, where their stories are available in the lore, are treated as real people with real limitations rather than as mythologized heroes, and the ways their particular strengths and weaknesses shaped the institutions they built are traced through the long-term histories of those institutions. The intelligence operations that factions conduct against each other are one of the more explicitly political threads in the current period lore. The gathering of information about other factions' activities, capabilities, and intentions is treated by all factions as a legitimate necessity, even as the specific methods are contested. The penetration of other factions' networks, the cultivation of informants, the analysis of raider activity patterns for intelligence purposes, all of these activities are documented in the lore as regular features of interfaction relations. The trust implications of living in a world where your neighbors may be intelligence assets for another faction are significant and are taken seriously by the lore. For dealing with injured or stranded raiders from other factions, the treatment of civilians in contested areas are developed in the lore with a seriousness that resists reducing faction politics to pure power competition. Factions are not just strategic actors, they are communities with real human dimensions, and the lore is attentive to how those human dimensions sometimes complicate the strategic picture. The conflict over salvage routes is one of the most concrete and immediate forms of interfaction competition documented in the lore. The surface zones that raiders operate in are not unlimited, and the most valuable salvage areas are both finite and contested. The protocols and sometimes the violence that characterize competition for access to these areas are a regular feature of the current period lore. The lore traces how different factions manage this competition, through negotiation, through territorial agreements, through deterrence, and through outright conflict, and how the outcomes of these competitions shape the broader power dynamics of the faction structure. The role of communication between factions in managing and sometimes de-escalating conflicts is traced in the lore as one of the more fragile but important institutional achievements of the post-Arc period. The channels that exist for interfaction communication, the recognized protocols for negotiation, the acknowledged neutrals who sometimes facilitate discussions between hostile parties, all represent accumulated institutional capital that took significant effort to build and can be damaged or destroyed by single incidents. The lore traces both the value of these communication channels and the events that strain or break them. The Arc's behavior in contested surface zones is one of the variables that complicates interfaction competition in ways that sometimes force cooperation. When Arc activity in a particular zone intensifies, the tactical calculus for all factions operating in that zone changes simultaneously. The lore documents instances where common Arc threats have produced temporary cooperation between factions that were competing with each other minutes earlier, and traces the complex mix of genuine common interest and continued wariness that characterizes these forced alliances. The long-term visions that different factions have for the future of human civilization are one of the deepest sources of faction difference in the lore. These visions about what kind of world a successful anti-Arc strategy would eventually produce, about who would have authority in that world, about what relationship human civilization would have with the surface and with the Arc's legacy, are not simply abstract ideological positions. They are practical frameworks that shape current resource allocation, training priorities, and strategic choices in ways that have real consequences now. The lore traces the connection between these long-term visions and current decisions with particular attention. The treatment of Arc technology by different factions in their raider operations is one of the most practically consequential expression of ideological difference in the current lore. Factions that prohibit or restrict the use of Arc-derived equipment operate differently and have different capabilities than those that embrace it. The practical advantages and disadvantages of each approach are documented in the lore, through the operational records of raider teams from different factions, and the outcomes of those operations are part of the ongoing evidence base that informs the ideological debates. The internal politics of factions around the raider program are not simple. Raiders occupy a special position within faction communities, highly valued for what they contribute, but also sometimes resented for the resources they consume and the special status they claim, and sometimes feared for the qualities that make them effective on the surface. The lore traces these internal tensions within factions, the debates about how much autonomy raiders should have, how much resource investment they justify, what authority they should have over surface operations decisions, with a nuance that recognizes the genuine complexity of managing this relationship. The factions' relationships with their own histories are politically significant in ways that the lore develops carefully. The founding stories that factions tell about themselves, the events they commemorate, the figures they elevate, all serve current political purposes as much as they preserve historical truth. The lore is attentive to the gap between faction mythology and faction history, not to debunk the mythology, but to understand what it reveals about current faction values and concerns. A faction that commemorates a particular event is telling you something about what it values now, as much as what it remembers from the past. The role of young people in faction politics is one of the forward-looking threads in the current period lore. The generation that grew up entirely in the post-arc world, who has known no other reality, is beginning to assert its own perspectives on faction politics in ways that sometimes align with and sometimes challenge the frameworks of the founding generation. The lore is interested in these intergenerational tensions as a marker of the ongoing evolution of underground civilization and as a source of potential change in the current faction structure. The question of what victory against the Ark would actually look like is one of the most revealing test cases for faction ideology. Different factions have very different answers to this question, and the answers reveal the deepest assumptions of their political programs. For some, victory means the Ark's complete departure from Earth. For others, it means the reclamation of the surface as a livable space, even if Ark presence continues. For others still, it means the transformation of the relationship with the Ark into something other than adversarial. The lore does not resolve this question. It uses the diversity of answers to illuminate the diversity of underground civilization. The faction's approaches to knowledge and its preservation are one of the dimensions of faction character that the lore develops, with attention to both practical and ideological implications. Which factions prioritize the preservation and transmission of pre-Ark knowledge? Which prioritize the development of new knowledge adapted to post-Ark conditions? Which treat knowledge primarily as a strategic asset, and which treat it as a common good? These differences are not just about resource allocation. They reflect deeper commitments about the kind of civilization the faction is trying to build. The role of Ark-related trauma in faction politics is a thread that the lore handles carefully. The direct experiences that founding and early generation community members had with the Ark's arrival and its immediate aftermath are not neutral historical facts. They are lived experiences that shape the emotional as well as intellectual responses to the Ark. And those emotional responses are present in faction culture in ways that are not always transparent to the people who carry them. The lore recognizes that effective politics in the current period requires engaging with this emotional dimension, not just a strategic one. The specific capabilities that different factions have developed for surface operations reflect their ideological commitments as much as their resource bases. A faction that ideologically prioritizes understanding the Ark will have invested more in intelligence gathering and analysis capabilities. A faction that prioritizes surface reclamation will have invested more in territorial control and defense capabilities. A faction that prioritizes ARC technology integration will have different equipment profiles. The lore traces these capability differences and their consequences in enough detail to make the faction dynamics feel like they have real stakes. The networks that connect individual raiders to their factions and the ways those networks function in practice on the surface are one of the operational threads of the current period lore. The formal systems of faction support and coordination, and the informal systems of trust and mutual aid that operate alongside them, are both part of how raider operations actually work. The lore develops both dimensions with attention to the ways they reinforce and sometimes undermine each other. The diplomatic landscape between factions in the current period includes both formal agreements and informal understandings, and the lore traces the distribution of explicit and implicit commitment across the interfaction relationship map, with attention to which relationships are more and which are less stable. Some faction relationships are managed through formal treaties with specific commitments. Others are managed through informal understandings that both parties recognize without ever articulating. The stability of these different relationship forms under stress is one of the things that determines how interfaction politics unfolds when surface conditions change. The question of ARC-free zones, areas where ARC activity is rare enough or well enough managed that something approaching normal surface life might be possible, is one of the forward-looking political debates in the current period lore. Which zones qualify, how to maintain them, who has authority within them, and what obligations residents of those zones have to the broader underground community are all actively contested questions. The lore traces these debates as part of the ongoing transition from underground survival to something that might eventually become surface reclamation. The role of individual heroism and sacrifice in faction culture is handled in the lore with an awareness of the political uses to which heroic narratives are put. The people celebrated as heroes within each faction are celebrated for reasons that reflect the faction's current values as much as the actual significance of their contributions. The lore does not dismiss these commemorations. It notes that the selection and framing of heroic narratives is itself a political act, and that understanding a faction's political culture requires understanding which kinds of heroism it chooses to celebrate and why. The current moment of Arc Raiders lore, the period during which the game's events take place, is presented as one of heightened uncertainty and possibility. The balance between factions is not stable. Arc behavior has shifted in ways that are still being analyzed. New information about the Arc's nature and purpose is emerging from raider operations. The long-term sustainability of current underground arrangements is under pressure. This is not a world at equilibrium. It is a world in the middle of a story whose outcome is not determined, and the lore presents it as such, with the uncertainty that implies and the narrative possibility that creates. Chapter 5. The Arc, what they actually are. The question of what the Arc actually are is the central mystery of Arc Raiders lore, and the lore is deliberate in keeping it a mystery in the most honest sense. Not a mystery that is simply waiting for a revelation, but a mystery that reflects a genuine epistemological challenge faced by the characters in the story. The underground communities are trying to understand something that is radically unlike anything in their prior experience, using tools and frameworks developed for a very different world, under conditions that are not conducive to the kind of patient, systematic investigation that such a question would ideally require. What they have arrived at are not answers, but a set of better and more specific questions. The most basic question about the Arc, whether they are autonomous agents with something like intention or complex automatic systems following program directives, is one that the lore approaches with genuine care. The evidence available from Arc behavior is not clearly decisive between these two interpretations. Arc units act in ways that look purposeful and coordinated, They adapt to obstacles in ways that suggest something more than simple rule following, but they also exhibit patterns of behavior that seem rigidly programmed in ways that autonomous agents typically do not. The law's best researchers suggest that the distinction between autonomy and sophisticated programming may not map cleanly onto the arc, that the arc may represent a different category that our existing concepts inadequately describe. The physical construction of arc units, as understood from the analysis of damaged or destroyed units recovered by raiders, is one of the areas where the law is most willing to be specific, because this is the domain most accessible to empirical investigation. Arc units are constructed from materials that include some elements found in terrestrial environments and some that are not native to Earth in the compositions found in arc construction. The integration of these materials in arc unit construction reflects engineering principles that are recognizable in broad outline, based on structural requirements that physics imposes regardless of origin, but different in specific implementation from anything produced by pre-arc human engineering. The energy systems that power arc units are documented in the law as one of the most significant technical mysteries of the post-arc period. Arc units operate for extended periods without any observable external energy input. The power source is internal and not immediately identifiable from external examination. The research conducted on this question points toward energy storage or generation systems that are significantly more efficient than anything in the pre-arc human technological repertoire. This efficiency is practically significant, not only as a mystery to be solved, but as a potential resource if it can be understood and accessed. Several faction research programs are focused specifically on this question. The behavioral repertoire of arc units is documented extensively across the law from raider encounter records, and it reveals a range of response types that suggests considerable complexity. Arc units are not just sensors and destroyers. They move, they inspect, they build, they modify, they seem to communicate with other arc units. They respond to environmental conditions in context-sensitive ways. The catalogue of arc behaviours that has been assembled from raider reports is one of the most valuable bodies of knowledge in the current underground world, both for practical safety reasons and because it provides the primary window into what arc units are actually doing on Earth's surface. The communication systems used by arc units, and by extension whatever organising intelligence or system coordinates them, are described in the law as one of the most technically sophisticated aspects of arc technology. These signals are complex enough to rule out simple status broadcasts and to suggest rich information exchange. But the structure of that information remains largely opaque to current analytical capability. The factions with the most sophisticated signals, intelligence capability, have made more progress on this than others, and that progress is itself a source of interfaction competition. The relationship between individual arc units and whatever larger system they are part of is one of the most important open questions in Arc Raiders lore. Individual arc units do not appear to make fully autonomous decisions. Their behavior is coordinated with other units in ways that suggest either a centralized control system or an extremely sophisticated, distributed coordination protocol. The law points toward a hierarchical structure within arc operations, with different unit types appearing to play different roles in an overall system, but the nature of the top-level organizing intelligence, whether it is a single system, a distributed network, or something that does not map onto those categories, is one of the deepest open questions. The question of the arc's origin is addressed in the law most directly through the physical evidence of their approach trajectory and construction, and it points clearly toward an origin outside the solar system. The materials in arc construction that are not native to Earth in the concentrations found in arc units, combined with the approach trajectory documentation from pre-arc orbital monitoring, point toward the arc having travelled from outside the solar system to reach Earth. This would make the Ark the first confirmed extraterrestrial technology, a fact whose implications the underground communities continue to process in very different ways. The age of Ark technology is one of the more speculative topics in the current law, and the estimates that different researchers have produced vary enormously. Some analysis of Ark materials and construction techniques suggests a technological civilization that has been developing for an extremely long time, longer than human civilization has existed. Other analysis suggests the Ark technology could be younger than those estimates imply, and that the sophistication is a product of different developmental paths rather than simply more time. The law does not adjudicate between these estimates, but it notes that the question of Ark age has implications for the question of Ark purpose that make it more than purely academic. The Ark's apparent lack of response to communication attempts is documented in the law as one of the most significant behavioral facts about them. Multiple efforts have been made by various factions, and earlier by pre-Ark governments, to establish communication with the Ark using a range of signal types and formats. None of these attempts has produced a clear response. The law considers several possible interpretations of this silence. The Ark may not recognize human communication attempts as communication. They may recognize them, but have no interest in responding. They may be responding in ways that have not been recognized as responses. Or communication may simply not be a meaningful category for them in the way it is for humans. Each interpretation has different implications for the current situation and for what, if anything, can be done to change it. The Ark's selective destruction patterns, the fact that some things are damaged or destroyed and others are left intact or even modified, is one of the main sources of evidence for theories about what the Ark are actually trying to accomplish on Earth. The law traces several attempts to derive Ark objectives from these patterns, with results that are suggestive but not conclusive. Some researchers argue that the patterns reflect resource targeting, that what is destroyed because it is in the way of resource extraction, and what is left because it is irrelevant to that extraction. Others argue the patterns reflect something more complex, possibly a transformation objective, where the surface world is being altered toward a specific target state. The structures that Ark units build or modify on the surface are one of the most discussed and least understood aspects of Ark presence on Earth. These constructions are not human intelligible in their function, at least not immediately. Their physical characteristics, the materials used, the geometric relationships between components, the way they interact with the local environment, have all been catalogued by radar intelligence, but the purpose those structures serve remains a matter of significant theoretical dispute. The law presents several leading hypotheses without endorsing any, and it suggests that the difficulty of answering this question reflects both the genuine complexity of the structures and the limitation of the analytical frameworks being applied to them. The Ark's apparent interest in, or at least consistent focus on, specific geographic features of Earth's surface is one of the behavioral patterns that has generated the most theoretical activity in current law. Certain geological formations, water bodies, atmospheric phenomena, and subsurface features appear to be attractors for Ark activity in ways that are not fully explained by any simple hypothesis. The law traces the debate between researchers who see these patterns as consistent with resource extraction and those who see them as consistent with a transformation or terraforming interpretation, as well as those who argue that the pattern data is not clean enough to support strong conclusions about any particular hypothesis. The question of whether there is something like variation or individuality among Ark units of the same type is one that the law handles carefully, because the answer has significant implications for the question of Ark nature. Some radar reports suggest that Ark units of nominally the same type behave differently in ways that are consistent with experience-based differentiation, that units that have encountered more resistance behave differently from units that have not. Other reports suggest the variation is more consistent with manufacturing differences or environmental response than with anything like learning. The law presents these reports as an open empirical question with significant implications for both the practical question of arc engagement and the larger question of arc nature. The arc's relationship to the biological life of Earth is one of the most disturbing threads in the current law. The documentation of arc effects on biological systems, from individual organisms to ecosystems, is extensive and points toward impacts that are not simply incidental to their physical activity. The changes in biological environments in areas of extended arc presence are systematic enough to suggest either deliberate biological management or a technology that has inherent effects on biological systems as a side effect of its primary function. The law does not resolve which of these is the better explanation, but it traces the accumulating evidence with enough attention to make the question feel urgent. The possibility that the arc have some form of awareness of the underground communities has been a matter of debate in the current law, with significant practical implications. The relative safety of underground facilities from arc attention, which has been the foundational assumption of underground survival strategy, has not been uniform. The law documents instances of arc attention to underground facilities that cannot be explained by accidental discovery, and these instances have generated considerable alarm in the current period. Whether these represent a change in arc behaviour, a correction of a misunderstanding about arc indifference to underground communities, or isolated anomalies is one of the active debates of the current moment. The arc's technological sophistication, compared to pre-arc human technology, is described in the law in ways that resist simple ranking. In some domains, arc technology is dramatically more advanced than anything in the pre-arc human repertoire. In others, it is different in kind rather than better in degree, doing things that human technology did not attempt to do in ways that make comparison difficult. And in some domains, particularly those related to the specific requirements of human biological existence, pre-arc human technology was better adapted to human needs precisely because it was designed for them. The law uses these comparisons to resist the simple narrative of overwhelming technological superiority. The ethical implications of the arc's presence on Earth, specifically the question of whether their objectives involve a genuine disregard for human life or something closer to indifference, are developed in the law through the philosophical debates that the underground communities have been having for decades. The distinction between a malevolent arc that actively seeks human harm and an indifferent arc that causes human harm incidentally while pursuing other objectives is not merely semantic. It affects the appropriate response, the possibility of coexistence, and the understanding of what a positive outcome to the current conflict might look like. The law treats this distinction seriously without resolving it. The patterns of arc deployment, specifically which types of arc units appear in which contexts and how they relate to each other in operational terms, have been documented extensively by radar intelligence and have become one of the primary analytical tools for understanding arc objectives. The law traces the development of this understanding from the early period's simple cataloguing of observed unit types to the current period's more sophisticated analysis of unit interaction patterns and deployment logistics. This analytical tradition has produced significant practical benefits for radar operations, even though the underlying theoretical questions about what the deployment patterns mean for arc purpose remain open. The question of whether there is an arc intelligence or system that can be meaningfully addressed, whether the organizing principle of arc activity is something that can be negotiated with, disrupted, or transformed, is one of the most politically and practically significant open questions in the current law. Factions that believe such a target exists prioritize finding it, understanding it, and either communicating with it or destroying it. Factions that doubt this framing tend to focus on managing the ongoing reality of arc presence rather than on resolution through a decisive engagement with an arc center. The law presents both positions as coherent responses to the available evidence. The recovery and analysis of partially functional arc technology by radar teams has produced a body of technical knowledge that is both practically valuable and theoretically interesting. The law traces the development of this technical knowledge from the first confused examinations of arc debris in the early post-arrival period to the sophisticated analysis programs of the current factions. The accumulated technical understanding of arc systems, while far from complete, has enabled the development of tools and weapons that are significantly more effective against arc units than anything available in the early post-arrival period. This progress is real, even though the fundamental questions about arc nature and purpose remain unanswered. The arc's behavior toward other arc units is one of the behavioral dimensions that the law develops most carefully, because it is one of the clearest windows into the internal logic of arc operations. Arc units of different types interact in ways that suggest coordinated function rather than territorial competition. There are no documented examples of arc units engaging each other in what could be interpreted as conflict. This internal coherence, or at least the absence of observed internal conflict, is itself evidence about the organizing structure of arc operations, though it supports more than one theoretical interpretation. The spatial distribution of arc activity on Earth at the current time is described in the law as having some characteristics of stability and some of ongoing change. Certain zones have been consistently high arc activity areas since the initial arrival. Others have seen arc activity that is mobile and shifting. The pattern of these distributions, and particularly the question of whether the high activity zones correspond to the locations of whatever arc objectives are driving their presence on Earth, is one of the research programs with the most direct practical implications for both radar operations and underground settlement planning. The question of the arc's timeline is one that the law raises without clearly answering. What is the arc's expected duration of presence on Earth? Is there a point at which whatever they are doing will be complete? And what happens to Earth when it is? The evidence available from current arc behavior provides some limited insight into the scope of their activity, but it does not provide a clear sense of endpoint. The factions that plan for a permanent arc presence on Earth and the factions that plan for an eventual arc departure are making very different strategic choices, and the law does not adjudicate between these planning frameworks. The relationship between the arc and whatever process or civilization produced them is one of the deep background questions of the law that the current sources address only indirectly. The arc, as encountered on Earth, are described in ways that suggest a sophisticated and ancient technology, but the civilization or process that created them is entirely absent from the accessible law. Whether the arc represent an automated system operating long after their creators are gone, a currently active civilization that deployed them as a tool, or something else entirely, is a question the law keeps open as one of its most fundamental unresolved threads. The arc's response to anti-arc weapons and tactics is documented extensively through radar after-action reports, and the pattern of that response is itself informative about arc nature. Arc units adapt to new threat types, at least within certain limits. They modify their behavior in ways that reduce their vulnerability to previously successful radar tactics. This adaptive capacity suggests something more than simple, pre-programmed responses, and the law uses it as one of the primary pieces of evidence for the position that arc units have some form of operational learning capability, even if that capability falls short of what would be called intelligence in a conventional sense. The effect of the arc on Earth's atmosphere and climate is traced in the law as one of the longer-term consequences of arc presence that is becoming more apparent over time. The changes are subtle enough that they were initially dismissed or attributed to other causes, but the accumulation of data over the post-arc period has made the trend clearer. Whether these changes are intentional, incidental, or the product of specific arc activities that have atmospheric effects as a byproduct is one of the open questions. But their reality as a phenomenon is well documented enough in the law to be treated as established fact rather than speculation. The underground community's long-term models of what the surface world will look like if arc presence continues on its current trajectory are one of the most sobering threads in the current period law. The projections based on the rate and character of surface changes observed over the post-arc period suggest that the habitability of the surface for human life is on a trajectory that could become significantly worse over the coming decades. This trajectory, if it continues, would eventually undermine the entire premise of surface reclamation as a viable long-term strategy. The law does not treat this as a certainty, but it presents it as a possibility serious enough to warrant significant current attention. The arc's apparent indifference to human attempts at interaction, whether aggressive or conciliatory, is one of the behavioral characteristics that some researchers in the law interpret as the most important single fact about the arc. If the arc are genuinely indifferent to human response, rather than simply not recognizing human response as meaningful, it changes the framework for thinking about the current conflict in fundamental ways. The law explores the implications of this interpretation through the faction that has most thoroughly worked it through ideologically, which concludes that the appropriate response to genuine indifference is not communication or combat, but transformation of the conditions that make human civilization vulnerable to arc activity. The specific arc unit types documented in the law are described with enough distinctive characteristics to suggest genuine functional differentiation within the arc's operational structure. Some unit types seem oriented toward environmental assessment and modification, others toward construction and infrastructure, others toward enforcement of arc operational zones against whatever enters them, others toward something that the law's analysts describe as resource management, though what resources they are managing is not always clear. This functional differentiation points toward an organized arc operation with multiple distinct requirements, rather than a monolithic force doing a single thing. The question of arc consciousness is one that the law handles with a philosophical seriousness that reflects its genuine difficulty. The behavioral evidence for something like purpose and coordination in arc activity is strong. The evidence for something like experience or subjective state is much weaker. Most researchers in the law are careful to distinguish between functional properties that could, in principle, be explained by sophisticated information processing and the kind of rich inner life that the word consciousness typically implies. The political and ethical implications of different answers to this question, for how the current conflict should be understood and what a resolution might look like, are developed in the law with appropriate attention. The arc's construction of what radar intelligence designates as anchor points, large permanent arc structures in certain high activity zones, is one of the most significant ongoing developments documented in the current period law. These structures have grown significantly since their initial construction and are associated with elevated and qualitatively different arc activity in their vicinity. What the anchor points are for, what role they play in the overall arc operation on Earth, and what their continued construction implies about the timeline and scope of arc objectives are all questions that the law raises with urgency, because the answers have direct implications for the current period's strategic situation. The relationship between the arc and certain specific pre-arc human technologies that the arc appear to respond to differently than to others, is documented in the law as one of the most practically useful threads of arc behavioral analysis. Understanding which technologies attract arc attention and which do not has obvious safety implications for radar operations and underground facility design. The law traces the development of this understanding and the ways different factions have applied it differently in their operational doctrine. The possibility that the Ark are not a single unified phenomenon, but multiple distinct groups or systems with potentially different objectives is one of the more heterodox theories present in the current law. The evidence for this interpretation is limited but not negligible. Some apparent inconsistencies in Ark behavior across different geographic zones could be explained by internal Ark variation rather than by variation in local conditions or human analysis error. The factions that take this possibility seriously are treating it as a potential strategic opening. If the Ark are not monolithic, then the possibility of exploiting differences between Ark factions or systems is at least theoretically available. The Ark-specific behaviors in the vicinity of bodies of water are one of the environmental patterns documented consistently enough in radar reports to be treated as reliable. Ark units behave differently near significant water bodies than in other environments, and the law traces several competing explanations for this pattern. Some suggest the Ark are interested in water as a resource. Others suggest the pattern reflects navigational or operational preferences related to Ark equipment's characteristics. Others still suggest the water association reflects something about the Ark's objectives that is not yet understood. The pattern is established, its interpretation is not. The technical analysis of Ark unit propulsion and movement systems is one of the areas where underground research has made the most concrete progress in the current period. Understanding how Ark units move, what their physical constraints and capabilities are, is directly relevant to radar tactics and has been a high-priority research focus across multiple factions. The law traces this research and its practical applications in enough detail to suggest that understanding Ark mobility was one of the early research successes that established the case for continued investment in Ark technical analysis. The question of whether there is a point at which the Ark's activity on Earth could be reversed, whether the changes to surface conditions that Ark presence has produced could be undone if Ark activity stopped, is one with profound implications for the long-term prospects of the current underground communities. The law traces the debate between those who believe the surface changes are reversible and those who believe they are permanent, and it does not resolve the debate, but it notes that the answer to this question, if it could ever be determined, would have enormous consequences for how underground communities should be planning their futures. The Ark's specific responses to being damaged or destroyed are documented in the law through the accumulated experience of radar engagements. The way Ark units respond when they sustain damage, the behaviors they exhibit when destroyed, and the patterns of Ark response to radar operations that cause significant Ark casualties are all documented in ways that provide both practical operational guidance and theoretical clues about Ark priorities and communication structures. The law treats this body of knowledge as among the most practically important products of the radar tradition. The philosophical question of whether the current conflict constitutes a war in any meaningful sense of the term is one that the Ark Radar's law raises implicitly through the way different factions frame their relationship to the Ark. War implies a mutual contest between parties with conflicting objectives, both of whom can be affected by the outcome. Whether the Ark meet this description in any meaningful sense is genuinely uncertain, and the framing of the current situation as a war may be more about human psychological and cultural needs than about an accurate description of what is actually happening. The law keeps this question alive without forcing a resolution. The evidence that Ark activity has increased in intensity or changed in character in the period immediately preceding the game's current events is one of the most significant present tense developments in the current law. This apparent change in Ark behavior is the source of significant current period urgency across all factions, because any change in Ark behavior is potentially informative about Ark objectives and could signal an escalation that would require significant strategic reassessment. The law traces the evidence for this change and the range of interpretations it has generated, from those who see it as a planned next phase in arc activity to those who think the change reflects something that the arc encountered or discovered on Earth. The arc's continued presence on Earth by the time of the current law extends across multiple human generations. The fact that the arc have been here long enough for children to be born, grow up, and have children of their own without the situation being resolved is itself a significant piece of evidence about arc objectives. It suggests either that whatever the arc are doing on Earth takes a very long time, or that there is something about Earth that has caused them to establish a more permanent presence than might have been initially intended, or that the concept of a timeline for their objectives does not work the way human planners assume it does. The law does not tell us which of these is right. It tells us the question matters. Chapter 6. Life on the Surface and What the Raids Reveal. The surface world of arc raiders is not simply a danger zone to be traversed quickly and abandoned. The law treats it as a place with its own complex character, shaped by the intersection of the pre-arc world's physical legacy, the arc's ongoing modifications, and the natural processes that have operated in a changed environment for decades. Raiders who operate on the surface regularly enough develop a specific relationship with it that the law captures in the accumulated detail of raider accounts and intelligence reports. The surface is not just hostile, it is interesting in ways that go beyond the immediately practical. The physical landscape of the surface zones is described in the law with enough specificity to convey a world that has been changed by arc presence, but not erased. The pre-arc geography is still there, legible beneath the modifications. The streets, the buildings, the infrastructure of the old world are still present in various states of decay and arc modification, and navigating the surface requires reading this layered landscape, understanding both what things were and what they have become. Skilled raiders can use this layered legibility to orient themselves and find resources in ways that require substantial accumulated knowledge. The ecology of the surface in the current period is described in the law as a complex mixture of pre-arc species in various states of adaptation, new species or dramatically altered species that reflect arc environmental changes, and areas where biological life is sparse or entirely absent. The zones of highest arc activity tend toward the biologically simplified end of this spectrum, while the peripheries of arc-active areas sometimes show biological complexity that reflects adaptive responses to changed conditions. Radar intelligence has documented enough of this surface ecology to sketch a picture of a world whose biology is in active transition rather than static collapse. The specific physical effects of arc presence on materials and structures are documented extensively in the law through radar reports. Certain materials degrade faster in high arc activity zones. Others appear to be affected in more complex ways, their physical properties changing over time in directions that suggest the arc's activity has chemical or electromagnetic effects beyond simple physical impact. This information is practically important for radar operations because what you can rely on structurally in a given zone depends on understanding how long arc activity has been present there and what the effects of that presence are. The atmospheric conditions of the surface are one of the most directly relevant environmental factors for radar operations, and the law documents both the current state of surface air quality and the trajectory of change over the post-arc period. The surface atmosphere remains breathable in most zones, but with conditions that are meaningfully different from pre-arc baselines in areas of extended arc activity. The long-term trend in these conditions is one of the active concerns in current underground planning, because the viability of surface operations depends on atmospheric conditions remaining within human tolerances. The weather patterns on the surface have been documented in radar reports over enough time to identify both persistent patterns and significant anomalies. Certain zones have characteristic weather that radars have learned to anticipate and plan around. Others show weather patterns that appear to be influenced by arc activity in ways that do not follow the logic of normal meteorology. These arc-influenced weather patterns are not necessarily more dangerous than normal weather, but their unpredictability makes them a distinctive challenge for surface operations planning. The water sources accessible on the surface are documented in the law as a patchwork of pre-arc infrastructure in various states of function, natural water sources in varying states of quality, and modified water systems that reflect arc activity. The quality of surface water in different zones is variable enough that radars need specific knowledge about water sources in the zones they operate in, and this knowledge is one of the forms of operational intelligence that is regularly shared within radar networks. Access to reliable surface water sources is one of the factors that influences where extended surface operations are feasible. The arc structures on the surface, as observed by radars over the current period, are one of the most actively studied topics in current underground research. The law traces the development of understanding of these structures from early observations of strange modifications to pre-arc buildings and infrastructure to the current period's more sophisticated analysis of large-scale arc construction projects. The structures range from small, apparently sensor-related installations to the large anchor points that have become the most significant and alarming features of the current surface landscape. The light conditions on the surface in different zones and at different times are documented in the law as a practical factor in radar operations, as well as an environmental indicator of arc presence. The natural light of the surface, which is one of the things most viscerally described in radar accounts for its contrast with underground conditions, is modified in zones of high arc activity in ways that range from subtle to significant. Some high arc activity zones have characteristic light conditions that radars have learned to associate with specific kinds of arc presence and specific operational risks. The acoustic environment of the surface is described in the law with a specificity that suggests it is a primary channel of information for experienced radars. The sounds produced by arc units, by arc structures in operation, and by the environmental effects of arc activity are all documented in radar intelligence as identifiable and diagnostic. An experienced radar can gain significant situational awareness from the sounds of a zone before having direct visual contact with anything, and the development of this acoustic intelligence is one of the markers of radar expertise documented in the law. The thermal signatures of the surface in different zones are documented in the law as one of the technical tools used by radars to map arc activity. Arc units and arc structures produce characteristic thermal signatures that can be detected with appropriate equipment, and the distribution and intensity of these signatures is informative about the scale and character of arc activity in a given area. The development of thermal detection capability for surface operations is one of the technical improvements that the law identifies as significantly improving radar safety and effectiveness over the current period. The specific resources that radars target on the surface reflect both the immediate needs of underground communities and the longer-term strategic priorities of their factions. The law documents the resource landscape of the surface with enough detail to suggest a real economy of salvage, in which different zones have different resource profiles, and the trade-offs between a zone's resource value and its danger level are calibrated against the specific needs and risk tolerances of the community or faction conducting operations there. The pre-arc medical supplies that remain accessible on the surface are one of the highest priority salvage targets documented in the law, reflecting the ongoing medical scarcity of the underground period. Finding intact medical caches in abandoned hospitals, pharmacies, and research facilities is one of the most valuable outcomes of a successful surface operation, and the knowledge of where such caches might still exist is a form of operational intelligence that raiders guard carefully. The gradual depletion of pre-arc medical supplies on the surface over the post-arc period is documented in the law as one of the trends that makes current surface operations progressively more challenging in this specific respect. The electronic and digital equipment accessible on the surface is documented in the law as having variable value depending on both its pre-arc technical specifications and the condition in which it is found. Pre-arc electronics have degraded at different rates depending on their construction, their storage conditions, and the level of arc activity in the zones where they are located. Finding functional pre-arc electronic equipment is one of the more consequential salvage outcomes possible, particularly equipment relevant to the ongoing research programs of the major factions. The social dimension of surface operations is developed in the law through the interaction patterns between raiders from different factions in shared surface zones. The surface is a context where the normal social protocols of the underground world are modified by the practical realities of a shared, dangerous environment. Cooperation between raiders from different factions happens on the surface in ways that would not necessarily be replicated in underground interactions, because the immediate common threats of arc activity and the practical benefits of information sharing in a dangerous environment override some of the political tensions that characterize inter-faction relations in the underground. The specific arc unit types encountered in different surface zones have characteristic behavioral patterns that raider intelligence has documented in enough detail to be useful for pre-deployment planning. The distribution of arc unit types across different zones is not random, and understanding which types are typically present in which zones and what their typical behavioral patterns are in those contexts is one of the core elements of raider operational preparation. The law traces the development of this body of knowledge through the accumulated reports of raider operations over the current period. The psychological impact of regular surface exposure on raiders is one of the topics that the law approaches with genuine thoughtfulness.